The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to John. Pilate said to Jesus, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus answered, "Do you say this on your own, or have others told you about me?" Pilate answered, "I am not a Jew, am I? Your own nation and the chief priest handed you over to me. What have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom does not belong to this world. If my kingdom did belong to this world, my attendants would be fighting to keep me from being handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not here." So Pilate said to him, "Then you are a king?" Jesus answered, "You say I am a king. For this I was born, and for this I came into the world, to testify to the truth. Everyone who belongs to the truth listens to my voice." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Once upon a time, a young lion wandered from his father to test whether or not he would get the same respect from the other animals as his father did. As the young lion approached some monkeys, he roared and asked, "Who is the king of the jungle?" The monkeys, being afraid, responded, "You are." The lion replied, "And don't you forget it." The lion repeated this to each animal in the jungle and got the same response until he came upon a herd of elephants. The little lion roared and asked, "Who is the king of the jungle?" The big bull elephant walked close to the lion, swooped him up in his trunk, banged him around on a few boulders, swung him around and around, and threw him into the river. Battered and wet, the little lion replied, "Hey, just because you didn't know the answer to the question doesn't mean you have to get so nasty about it." You know, all joking aside, having our college students back for the holidays just always does put me in the holiday spirit. I see you smiling, Monica. But one of our college students back here, one of our med students, Stephen Prespis, who's from my parish up in Wheeling, is going to be heading back to St. Mike's for Thanksgiving. So we'll be praying for you and your family. Today we close our church calendar year with a magnificent feast, the Feast of Christ the King. And people have asked me, from where did this feast come? Well, actually, in the whole scheme of things, it's a relatively new feast for the Catholic Church. It was instituted in 1925 by Pope Pius XI. And Pius instituted this feast because he was very, very concerned about what he saw going on in his native Italy and the world. And here's what was going on, among other things. He saw some of our Catholic biblical scholars listening to and being influenced by the Protestant biblical scholars from Germany. And what those men had done was to take the scientific method and apply it to the interpretation of the Scriptures. Pius felt that left unrestrained or without guidelines, they were going to dig way too deep. You know, how can you scientifically explain the resurrection, for instance? And he's concerned that some of these guys would get off the path, and they did, actually. He was concerned about modern technology, well, as modern as it could be for 1925. He felt there were a lot of things being thought about and planned that nobody bothered to take the time to look at the consequences of what these modern inventions could produce in our world. He was also very concerned about a man he saw walking around the streets preaching in Rome by the name of Benito Mussolini. He felt that he was way too arrogant and lacked humility. And he was very well aware, based on reports he received from the German Catholic Church, about a young man who had just been let out of prison, who was getting a lot of popularity and a lot of members in his newly found Nazi party, that is Adolf Hitler. And so what he did was he tried to think of an image that could capture the imagination of people all around the world, to help them realize that no matter how big you think you are, no matter how intelligent you think you are, No matter how important you think you are, there's always one that is light years ahead of you, namely Jesus Christ. And so he proclaimed the feast of Christ the King as the last weekend in the church calendar year. So, what does this feast have to say to us? First of all, our gospel comes from John chapter 18, and particularly John's passion narratives. We hear this reading every Good Friday in the Catholic Church around the world. But John's not the only one to give us a passion narrative. We find one in Mark 14, in Matthew 26, and Luke chapter 22. All very similar in what they have to say about Jesus' suffering and death. But John is unique in a lot of ways, and particularly the way he pictures Jesus. You see, if you looked at Mark's account, you would see Jesus as he goes into his passion as bewildered, as feeling totally abandoned even by God, as very, very nervous and beaten down. But not so in John's account. Jesus comes off like a superhero. For instance, in Mark's gospel, you have the Garden of Gethsemane scene, where Jesus goes into the garden and he prays. And Mark says so much so that the sweat coming off his head looks like drops of blood. And he prays, Father, if it is possible, let this cup that is suffering pass me by. But not my will, your will be done. Guess what? In John's gospel, Jesus doesn't go into the garden to pray. He'll be arrested there, and when the disciples try to figure out what in the world's happening, Jesus looks and says, what do you think I'm going to say? Father, let this cup pass me by? No, it was for this hour that I came to drink from the cup. Jesus is ready to duke it out with Satan, you see. After Jesus is tried and condemned to death, in Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospel, he is so worn out carrying that cross up to Calvary in the hot sun. He falls down several times. And so they force this guy named Simon, we're told he's a Cyrenian, to help Jesus carry the cross. In John's gospel, there is no Simon. Jesus carries the cross himself, thank you. He's strong enough to take it up to Calvary. And in Mark and Matthew's gospel, we find the dying Jesus cry out in agony to his Father. And he says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Those words are not in John's account. Jesus is busy as he's dying on the cross in John's gospel. And when it's time for him to die, when he chooses to die, John tells us, he simply says, it is finished, and he hands over his spirit. Satan, death, take nothing away from him. So you get a very gallant, a very victorious, a super strong Jesus, as we would expect, who came here to win our salvation and to return to the Father, and ain't nothing getting in his way. Well, today's gospel from John 18 is the trial scene of Jesus before Pontius Pilate. And as one scripture professor I had one time, an authority on John's gospel said, he said, for years we've called this Jesus' trial before Pontius Pilate. But truth be known, if you look at this passage, it's Pontius Pilate who's on trial before Jesus. Jesus is in charge of this scene, my friends, for sure, as we will see. And who is this Pontius Pilate? Believe it or not, we have more historical, factual information about Pilate than probably any figure in the Bible. We know from multiple witnesses throughout history that he was the Roman prefect, or procurator as he's called in the Gospels, for Rome. That means he was of the rank, let's say, of A. James Mansion. He was the governor. He was a big, big person. He ruled from 26 to 36 AD over the province of Judea, and he was brother-in-law to Caesar. Now, what amazes me is that there must have been some family problems, because for Caesar to stick his sister's brother at one of the far outposts that would be equivalent to the Russian front, out there to hang, means to me Pontius Pilate must have done something to upset Caesar. And so Caesar's watching out for him. What does he do? What kind of moves does he make? And so as the scene opens up, it's the Jewish feast of Passover. And we hear about crowds going to Jerusalem, but really the word crowds has been overblown throughout history. It's been estimated somewhere between 50 to 60,000 people came into Jerusalem for the Feast of Passover. Something like the population of the city of Huntington. No real big population. But Pilate was very aware that this guy Jesus from up north in Nazareth had come into the town with his disciples and some followers. And what he's hearing has him very concerned. First of all, the Jewish chief priests, the leaders of the people, have said, he claims to be God. Pilate laughed at that one. He could care less because as far as he was concerned, there was only one true God, and that was Caesar. Besides, Jews didn't have souls anyway, as far as he was concerned. He claims to be the Messiah. Once again, Pilate could care less. He held their religious beliefs in contempt. But when they said he claims to be king, both antennae went up on his head. Because Pilate knew very well, if word got back to his brother-in-law that there was some guy being allowed to be king under Roman occupation, that would have cost him his head in the Colosseum. So I told a student one time, he would have been invited to the Colosseum for lunch, and he would have been the main item on the menu. So, of course, he's very concerned. And when you compare Mark, Matthew, and Luke's accounts of the trial before Pontius Pilate, if you want to call it that, Jesus says very little. A word here, a word there. Pilate is totally in control of the conversation. But not so in John's account. We actually have Pilate going back and forth. He's inside the praetorium, he's outside the praetorium. He goes outside to ask the chief priests and scribes, what do you want me to do with this guy? And then he goes inside and he talks to Jesus, all the while pacing back and forth and wrenching his hands. He's very nervous because the last thing he wants is to have a riot during Passover, because he would have to act very forcibly with the troops he has. And so he tries to get to the bottom of it. So as the story opens up, he looks at Jesus and he says, are you the king of the Jews? And look what Jesus does. He answers a question with a question, something that drives attorneys crazy, huh, TJ? He looks and says, are you telling me this on your own volition, or have others told you about it? And Pilate snorts, because he knows it's like Jesus smacked him one. And he says, look, I ain't no Jew. And Jesus says, you know what? I ain't a king either in terms of the way you think it. Because if I was a king, like the kings here on earth, my subjects would be fighting to set me free from these religious leaders. So my kingdom is not in the world. And so Pilate comes back and he thinks he's got a little evidence. He says, so you are a king. Jesus said to him, totally blows that statement off. He says, the reason I came into this world was to testify to the truth. And those who follow me hear my voice and hear the truth. That's a confusing kind of thing, because here's what Pilate is hearing. In Greco-Roman thought, the whole idea of truth was a cognitive experience. I looked at the data and I determined true or false. It was all about the brain. It was a cerebral exercise. But not so for the Hebrew people. Emet, the Hebrew word translated literally into English, can be translated either trustworthy or faithful. Because you see, the Jewish people did not separate the brain from the emotions. They were one. And so in other words, what Jesus is saying to him is, you know what truth is by watching the way the people who live the truth conduct themselves. And in a line, a classic line that has echoed throughout history, the verse that's not included in this reading, it follows the end verse here. Pilate looks at Jesus and says, truth? What's truth? End of story. What does this passage mean for us? This feast, Christ the King, is most important. It's as important to us today as it was to Pius XI back in 1925 when he instituted it. How can I say that? Because our world is in a mess, a total mess. But you see, we Americans don't like the word king. You know, we got rid of the guy that wanted to be king over us back in 1776, right? We killed his troops and brought his troops and himself to their knees. We said we didn't want a king. We don't want that kind of stuff. And why? Because kings are notorious for grabbing power. They love to take land that doesn't belong to their own as their own. And they love to raise taxes. Sound familiar? Yeah, kings, messiahs, all the same. And so the idea of worshiping anyone as a king is repugnant. And then to be a king means you've got servants, you've got subjects, and we are called to be obedient. We don't like that word either. After all, it's about freedom, you know, freedom. I can serve whomever I want, and I'd rather not serve. I'd rather us all just kind of join hands around a circle and sing Kumbaya. That doesn't work with kingship, you see. So what are we to say about this feast? Well, unless you're a hypocrite, we utter the words that indicate our stance towards Jesus every weekend, if not every day. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Do you pray that prayer? Go to Matthew chapter 6. That's Matthew's text of the Lord's Prayer. We do say those words all the time. Do you hear yourself speak those words? Sometimes we say them so fast we don't give them any thought. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Those words say to us that we have surrendered to Jesus as our King. And what that means is we are his servants. We are called to be obedient to him. But are we? One of the greatest examples of this call actually came out a number of years ago. Someone came up with the idea of that purple bracelet with the letters WWJD on it. A lot of people wore them. Some people looked upon them as costume jewelry. You know, I got a WWJD. What would Jesus do? Well, that's what the servant asks every moment of their day. Before we make any business decisions, before we deal with children, spouses, whatever the case may be, before we travel about and associate with our friends, we ask the question, what would Jesus want me to do in this case? That's another way of saying he is sovereign over me. He is my king. He is my authority. And I am his servant. I don't debate as to whether or not to follow him. I do it automatically. Thy will be done. His will be done. So my brothers and sisters, something to ponder as we close the church calendar year. Next week, we have the first weekend of Advent, a chance to start all over again. But have we finished our work of surrendering to Jesus? Does he reign supreme in our lives, and especially in our hearts? Let us ask his forgiveness for the times when he blew him off, when we did not WWJD our lives. And let us pray for the grace instead of humility, so that we may surrender to him, so that when we say those words, thy kingdom come, thy will be done, we will show that we mean those words by the way we live them.